In the summer of 1904, a runner crossed the marathon finish line in St. Louis to thunderous applause, only to be disqualified when officials discovered he'd hitched a ride in a car for 11 miles of the course. The man who actually won had spent the final miles in a delirious stupor after his coaches fed him strychnine and brandy to keep his legs moving. He was handed the gold medal anyway, and that was just one afternoon at the 1904 World's Fair. This was the biggest, strangest, most revealing event in American history, and almost nobody talks about it. For 7 months in 1904, St. Louis threw open its doors to nearly 20 million visitors, more people than lived west of the Mississippi at the time. They came expecting a celebration. What the fair actually showed them was a portrait of America at full sprint. Brilliant, inventive, contradictory, and deeply ugly in ways that organizers considered perfectly normal. And the world it put on display is one we're still living in today. It started with the greatest land deal in history. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson bought 828,000 square miles of territory from Napoleon for $15 million, roughly 3 cents an acre, doubling the size of the United States in a single transaction. A century later, St. Louis decided to throw a birthday party for that deal, and they were not going to do it quietly. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition opened on April 30th, 1904, with over 1,500 buildings spread across 1,200 acres, connected by 75 miles of roads and walkways, the largest fair ever built to that point. More than 60 countries and 43 of the then 45 American states maintained exposition spaces. Organizers said that it was impossible to see everything in under a week. Most visitors didn't try. St. Louis also pulled off the greatest power move in sports history. The 1904 Olympics had already been awarded to Chicago, but St. Louis was already hosting the World's Fair and threatened to stage a rival athletic competition that would dwarf the games entirely. Fearing the dispute would damage the Olympic movement, the IOC transferred the games to St. Louis. Chicago got nothing. So in the summer of 1904, one city had both the World's Fair and the Olympics, and the world had no choice but to show up. But what they found when they got there was something nobody had quite seen before. Walking into the fair in 1904 was like walking into the internet for the first time. Most Americans had never seen electric lighting on this scale. The fair debuted innovations including the X-ray machine, the electric typewriter, and a wireless telephone that transmitted music across the fairgrounds. Visitors held a cordless receiver to their ear and heard sound traveling through the air in 1904. Then there was the food. The fair is often credited with inventing the ice cream cone, the hot dog, iced tea, and cotton candy, though historians note most of these existed before 1904. What the fair actually did was popularize them, exposing millions of people to food they'd never tried, who then went home and spread the word. The ice cream cone story is the best of these. Syrian concessionaire Ernest Hamwai was selling crisp waffle pastries next to an ice cream vendor who ran out of dishes. Hamwai rolled one of his waffles into a cone and handed it over, and the idea spread instantly across the entire fair. The guest list reads like a time capsule. President Theodore Roosevelt, future President William Howard Taft, Apache leader Geronimo, Helen Keller, and a teenage T.S. Eliot, who was from St. Louis and spent hours wandering the fair's exhibits, an experience historians believe helped shape his later poetry. It was, by every measure, the greatest show on earth, which made what happened at the Olympics all the more surreal. The 1904 Games are the most disastrous in modern Olympic history, and the marathon is the reason. The race was held in 90-degree heat on a dust-covered road. Of the 32 competitors, 18 dropped out from exhaustion. One suffered a stomach hemorrhage and nearly died. A Cuban runner named Felix Carbajal stopped to eat apples from an orchard along the route, got stomach cramps, and still finished fourth. A South American runner was chased off the course by a pack of wild dogs. The first man across the finish line was an American named Fred Lors. Immediately disqualified, when it came out, he had ridden in a car for 11 miles. The actual winner, Thomas Hicks, spent the final miles in agony, kept moving only by doses of strychnine and brandy administered by his coaches. He was handed the gold medal. Strychnine was not yet banned. It was a different era. Even the man who organized the games called the marathon indefensible afterward and said he personally hoped it would never be run again. But the Olympics were just a sideshow at the fair. And the real sideshow was something far darker than a poisoned runner staggering across a finish line. Here's where it gets hard to watch. Alongside the wonder and the waffle cones, the 1904 World's Fair put human beings on display. Fair organizers brought 1,102 Filipinos to a 4,700-acre Philippine reservation designed to introduce Americans to their new colonial territory acquired after the Spanish-American War. The exhibit was framed as educational. Its actual purpose was to portray Filipinos as primitive people who needed American leadership to survive. The people had been trafficked under harsh conditions, and many did not survive. Burial plots in 2 St. Louis cemeteries were prepared in advance. The Olympics made it worse. Organizers staged a 2-day event called Anthropology Days, recruiting indigenous people from the fair's human exhibits to compete in Olympic sports with almost no instruction, then presenting the results as scientific proof of racial inferiority. The founder of the modern Olympics, Baron Pierre de Coubertin, called it a disgrace and refused to attend the St. Louis Games at all. This wasn't a fringe element, it was a centerpiece. The fair's organizers considered it as legitimate as the ice cream cone and the electric typewriter. That's the thing that makes the 1904 World's Fair so important to understand. The wonder and the horror that weren't in different parts of the fairgrounds. They were right next to each other. On December 1st, 1904, the fair closed. Nearly all 1,500 buildings were torn down. They'd been built from a cheap mixture of plaster and hemp designed to last exactly 7 months. The grand palaces, the electric billboards, the lagoons, gone almost overnight. Forest Park went back to being a park. 2 buildings survived. One became the St. Louis Art Museum. The other became the St. Louis Zoo. Both still stand today, free to visit on the exact ground where 20 million people once stood slack-jawed at the future, a future that was already in some ways arriving too fast for anyone to fully reckon with. The 1904 World's Fair gave America the ice cream cone, the wireless telephone, and a glimpse at the 20th century before it fully arrived. It also put human beings in enclosures and called it science, and did so proudly in front of 20 million people who mostly just nodded and moved on to the next exhibit. That's the thing about history. It's never just one story. The fair is a mirror of a nation at full sprint, brilliant and terrible, innovative and cruel, absolutely certain of its own greatness and completely blind to its own contradictions. And if you want to understand the modern era, you could do a lot worse than spending an afternoon in Forest Park in the summer of 1904. What other moments do you think tell 2 stories at once? Drop them in the comments. I'd genuinely love to cover them. And if this one got you thinking, subscribe, because we're just getting started.